So we are live. Thanks for appearing, Robin Hanson. For those who don't know, Robin Hanson is an associate professor of economics at George Mason University. And you'll be happy to know that I selected all the questions by betting market. So
I don't believe you.
Well, I actually did try to rig up a betting market in Monopoly money over the questions.
Okay.
Just because I thought the bit would be funnier. But I did end up betting in karma points, which have no tradable value.
So there is some dispute about which questions would be more interesting to discuss. Well, maybe we can just do them all, right? I mean, we'll just stay here for however long it takes.
Yeah. Or however long the betting market says it should go on for.
Okay.
So you have some interesting views on a variety of subjects. For example,
a great variety of subjects. I'm all over the place. Way too many topics. I should shut up and talk about fewer things, right?
Yeah. So, for example, on healthcare, your view is that more spending on healthcare does not correlate with better health outcomes.
Just to be clear, that's a basically standard view in that literature. That is, most the standard empirical measurements are of very little dependence, especially when we have randomized experiments. There's just very little correlation between more medicine in terms of more visits or more medical spending and health.
Yeah,
and that's not even a subject I've done so much research. I just reviewed the literature and took it seriously.
Yeah, so I've seen the literature that says that, but the curious thing is I've also seen some literature that says that cuts in public healthcare spending are often associated with worse health outcomes. So for example, a 2009 meta-analysis by McWilliams concluded that, quote, based on the evidence to date, the health consequences of uninsurance are real, vary in magnitude in a clinically consistent manner, strengthen the argument for universal coverage in the United States, and underscore the importance of evidence-based determinations in providing healthcare to a diverse population of adults. So would you disagree with the claim made by McWilliams, or is that consistent with the claim that
so the way I'd put it is that the strongest, clearest evidence is the things we should rely on, but there are many kinds of evidence, some of which are much weaker, and then it's just much more possible to pick and choose. So as you know, there are many areas of social science and human science research where there are just answers people want to believe. And, if you have enough studies, you can go select out, the studies that seem to lean in your direction. And that's definitely the sort of thing people like to do in this area. So I would focus most attention on the most solid, most reliable sort of studies. And this meta-analysis is presumably including a lot of weaker studies.
Yeah, so what would be some of the studies that you think are the most reliable, that lead you to the conclusion that more spending doesn't correlate with better health outcomes?
Well, the studies that are randomized experiments are the strongest studies, and the Rand Health Insurance Experiment, or the more recent Oregon Health Insurance Experiment, and there are some others. So, as you may know, there's a long tradition of thinking of randomized experiments as the most reliable source when there's a lot of confounding things and things people want to believe.
Right. So your view would be there should be less healthcare spending in the U.S. Cut healthcare in half, as you said in an article.
That is, if we were focused on the health outcomes, if we wanted to, the direct health outcomes are not being increased much. Now, you could make other sorts of arguments. You could say, well, we're just, showing how much we care about each other, or that we are, investing in innovation for future healthcare. And so even if it's not very useful now, it'll be useful in the future. So I gave a TED talk a few years ago on my book, Age of M. And at that TED talk, there was a head of the World Bank. And he gave a talk about World Bank spending. And he said, that his experts told him that building more hospitals in third world countries was a terrible investment, that the literature was pretty consistently that it was not improving health. But he said, but these countries want the hospitals. They feel like they aren't respectable countries if they don't have the respectable sort of hospitals that respectable countries have. And it was an aspiration of theirs to have more hospitals. And even if it wasn't very health effective, he didn't think, as the World Bank president, he could reasonably deny them money to build hospitals that wouldn't be effective, because that's just, how can you deny someone the aspiration to want to have the same sort of healthcare that other people have, even if it's not effective?
Yeah, so that's an interesting result. I would wonder if our goal is just to boost our signaling about how much we care about healthcare. I think that the healthcare system that we would arrive at is somewhat similar to the one that we have today.
I'm not so sure, but these things are all have path dependent. So once everybody thinks that the prestigious healthcare that respectable people get is the sort that we have, and if you gave them any other, then they'd feel deprived and cheated, because they aren't getting the respectable stuff. But in another world where other things looked more respectable, so the healthcare that we actually give people does actually cause them a lot of pain at the end of their life. For not very much extension of life. We are basically torturing people at the end of their life. So that's not really very caring. We also separate people away from their sick relatives and loved ones. In a more traditional society, sick people would be near other people around them who could more easily come and visit and care, and show they cared about them. Sending them off to a separate, hygienic, sterilized, ugly place. As you may know, most hospitals are not pretty, right? They're actually pretty ugly, and they're pretty cold, and they're not very reassuring in terms of just the layout and the colors and the arrangement of things. And even if you're in a hospital bed and you're hungry or you're sick or you're in pain, it's just often hard to get anybody's attention to help you with something. I mean, these things are not the sort of features you might design of a system that was designed to show somebody how much you cared about them.
Yeah, this reminds me of something that a friend of mine said, which is, he said, the real 1% is the 1% who soaks up 22% of healthcare spending.
Well, yeah.
Yeah, I agree that I think that at the end there's way too much money spent on end-of-life care to prolong people's fairly miserable existences at an enormous cost, for little benefit. So in terms of other things that you've written in your wide array of things that you've written about, so you've written about Futarchy. And
yes.
So for those who don't know, explain what Futarchy is.
So the idea here is, the slogan is vote on values, but bet on beliefs. So the idea is that we could do much better governance, even at the national or international level, with a different mechanism for making decisions, a governance mechanism. But that this mechanism could also be applied at much smaller scales, and it should be. And my main recommendation is not going to be to apply my proposal directly immediately on national scales. My proposal is going to be to get people to try small scale experiments in their club, in their church, in their firm. The same mechanism can help you make all sorts of decisions in your small organizations. And if we tried that out well enough, then we would get inspired to make bigger applications, and then eventually maybe we do it for the nation. But in order to show you just how far it could go, I paint a picture of more grand applications. But let me describe sort of a somewhat intermediate application, which is still pretty ambitious. And this is firing CEOs. So let's imagine we have a public company, and they have a CEO, and they also have a stock price, and they have a stock market. And in an ordinary stock market, you trade stock for cash. So if the price of the stock is $20, that means that you have to pay $20 to get a stock, or you could sell a stock for $20. And when you're thinking about trading in that stock market, what you ask yourself is, over all the scenarios that this company could be involved in each scenario, how much is that company worth? That is, how much revenue will it get in the future, and therefore how much price at the moment is it worth paying for that future revenue? And if you think the average of all that future revenue is more than 20, what you want to do is buy at 20 and sell as it goes up and make a different profit on the difference. Or if you think the price is less than 20 and you see the current price is 20, then you want to do is sell now and buy again later and again, profit from that difference. So that's an ordinary stock market. So my proposal is to make 2 new stock markets for each company like this. So these stock markets are the same as a regular stock market, except they have a condition. The trades in the stock market is called off if the condition isn't met. That's the key difference. So one condition will be, will the CEO be in power at the end of this quarter or not? In one of the markets, all the trades will be called off if the CEO is in power, and in the other market, all the trades will be called off if the CEO is not in power. And that's the only difference of these stock markets and a regular stock market. Now, the key idea is if you trade in one of these stock markets, you will now try to average over all the scenarios you can imagine the company you're in, but you will restrict yourself to the scenarios that match the condition. So if you're trading in the market that's called off if the CEO leaves office, you'll ask, in all the scenarios where this CEO stays in power till the end of the quarter, what is this company worth? And in the other market, you will ask, in all the scenarios where the CEO leaves by the end of the quarter, what is this company worth? And again, if you thought the price was too low, you'd buy, too high, you'd sell. And so now we get 2 different prices for the company. One, the price if the CEO stays, the other if the price if the CEO leaves. And the difference in those 2 prices is now the speculator's consensus estimate of the value the CEO is giving to the company. And the recommendation is to fire his ass or her ass if they aren't adding value to the company according to this metric. And that mechanism I just proposed to you is relatively simple and it generalizes. So just to review, what we needed here was an outcome measure, in this case, the stock price. For an ordinary for-profit, publicly traded company, often what management is trying to do is make the company worth more. And that's a good proxy for what the company should be doing. And the other thing we need is a discrete decision. Do we keep the CEO or get rid of the CEO? And if we have an outcome we want and a discrete decision, then we can create these kind of markets, which I call decision markets, which estimate the outcome conditional on which decision we make. And then by looking at the estimate that's highest, we can say that's the recommended decision. And that's a mechanism that can generalize beyond firing CEOs. And in fact, we could use that as a form of government. So we could have the outcome be some voted on measure of national welfare. We could elect a legislature and they could oversee bills that figure out how much trees are worth and how much leisure is worth and all the different things we value. And then we could have another part of the government where people propose new bills to change the laws. Maybe they use an auction to get on the agenda, and then betting markets estimate which bills would, if passed, increase national welfare, and that would be the proposed form of government. And like I said, that's to show you just how far the idea could go, but in fact, I would recommend you use it on very small scales. So for example, you could have a small company and have a new hire, and you could just estimate if you hired somebody, what would their performance review look like in a year, or what would their division outcome look like? And we could look at various candidates and you could hire the one who had the highest estimated outcome. I'm happy to repeat, you pick any key decision we make in the world, and I'm happy to outline for you how we could use this sort of mechanism to make more informed judgments.
Yeah, we could use it for deciding interview questions.
Right.
Yeah, one idea that I had would be that it could be used as a method of establishing anti-SLAPP law. So making it so that if the betting market predicts with more than 95% certainty that you're going to lose your case, then your case is dismissed as a frivolous lawsuit.
So even more generally, I teach law and economics. And so one of the major problems with our legal system is that legal process is expensive. And so what we would really like is cheap ways to make a good guess about what the legal system would decide without having to go through the whole process of the legal system. And so a simple mechanism would be somebody, makes a claim legally, and then we have a betting market about what the courts would decide if we had a trial about it. And then maybe in most cases, we just go with the betting market odds as the legal decision. That is, we just, do that. And that would be actually a way that we could have a much cheaper access to a legal system. So like you just outlined, if the betting markets say, it's very unlikely that I would be convicted of this, then, our treatment could be, it's as if I was innocent until, somebody managed to move those odds to something more dramatic.
Yeah, so there have been several criticisms of Futarchy that people have given. Most of them I don't think are very good criticisms of Futarchy, but
But of course, that's true of everything. Anything good or bad, most of the criticisms will be bad. So the fact that
yeah,
most of the criticisms bad about any one thing isn't much evidence about it. This just means most people, when they think of criticisms of things, they just don't do a very good job, right?
yeah. So I'll start with some of the criticisms that I think are the least persuasive criticisms, just so you can sort of outline how it would solve the problem.
Swat them down in here. We can
Yeah,
get practice in swatting them down.
yeah, so so one criticism, and this would not apply as much to the CEO markets, but this would apply more to governance, is it would be the evil rich people, stock market investors who have money and capital and have disproportionate power making the decisions over the government even more so than today, and it would concentrate power in the hands of an elite few and be bad as a result of that. So
first of all forms of government that we've ever had concentrate decision-making power. That's just the nature of governance, period. So even today in the system you're familiar with, you might elect a politician who then, appoints an agency head who then hires employees. It's the employees of the agency who are making a lot of decisions on your behalf. There's very concentrated power there relative to all the people that these decisions affect. The nature of governance is to, find people to specialize and have specialists make special decisions, and that's concentrating power. So there's really no escaping the concentration of power in governance. The only question is, who is it concentrated with, and is it concentrated well? Are they going to make good decisions? So if we say, well, you're concentrating it among the rich, well, first of all, I'll pause and say, look, have you seen the people who are the head of agencies? Have you looked? Because in fact, the people in government who are the head of most agencies are the rich. They are elites. They are not you or me, unless you're rich. Sorry, I don't actually know if you're rich, but I'm not. So, but going further, a betting market who allows anyone to participate, it doesn't just let you vote for whatever you want and get it. It gives you an incentive to bet if you think you're right, but if you're wrong, you get punished. And that's true if you're rich or if you're poor. So, you can't go to a horse race and because you're rich, throw a lot of money around and win horse race bets. That doesn't work. You have to bet on the winning horse or you lose money. And the rich people, if they like brown horses, that doesn't mean brown horses will win at the horse races just because rich people are betting on the brown horses. That's just now how it works. The point is that the betting markets are creating an incentive for people to guess what's going to be the winning horse. And yes, you can't bet if you don't have money, but the process is there to find out who will be the winning horse. And it's open to anybody who has any money to bet. And if rich people go try to throw their weight around without knowing what they're talking about, they're going to lose their money.
Yeah, and as you added earlier, in government, rich people who throw their weight around, who don't know what they're doing, in government generally pay no cost, and in fact cause large amounts of harm to people while bearing no fiscal cost. Yeah. So,
well, now, it's honestly we could ask, compared to everybody else, do rich people, when they influence policy, do they make it better or worse? And I'd have to say that's not obvious. Because even if the rich people are ignorant, other people are often even more ignorant. So, but it's still not a great system just to have, rich people running the government because they're rich and maybe a little better informed than everybody else. That's still, a pretty low bar.
Yeah. So as I say, I don't think that criticism is especially persuasive. So another criticism, which is the one that was raised in your debate with Mencius Moldbug, where I think you did quite well. It was the criticism that there is the possibility of manipulation of the markets. And so you might have people who have a stake in passing one policy bet that policy would make everything go great. And so explain why you don't think that criticism is persuasive.
So, this was one of the earliest criticisms I heard when I started to explore this over 30 years ago now, I guess. And I, paid close attention to it and looked at the theory and lab experiments, and I've done a lot of things on the issue. The key idea, say, if you had a committee and members of the committee were, say, biased, and they didn't want to make the decision that was best for the committee, they had their own agendas, then they might vote for items on the committee that were against sort of the committee's supposed purpose, but because they had their influence, they tried to get their way. In speculative markets, it's not the same thing. So in a speculative market, you would have to bet against your financial interest in order to try to get the price in a direction you want. So for example, let's say we had the CEO themselves in the fire of the CEO market. The CEOs, there's these two prices, and maybe the price for, if the CEO leaves is higher than the price that the CEO stays. And well, now the CEO would like to keep his job. So the CEO would like to bid up the price of the company if the CEO stays and bid down the price of the company if the CEO leaves, right? That would be an example here of manipulation. Now, the idea would be that they would be willing to lose some money in this market in order to keep their job, to mislead the market about the consequence of this action. And, if that's all that could happen, then that could make some sense. But the key point is that other people react to that. So other people in the market are looking for opportunities like this, where somebody would mess up the price and make it, out of whack because they were trying to distort things. That is, when you're trying to look for profit opportunities, you are exactly looking for distorted prices. You want the price to have been pushed too low, then you buy. If the price is pushed too high, then you sell. That's what you're looking for when you're looking for profit opportunities. So if people thought the CEO was in there pushing up their price, they would be very tempted to go push it back down again. And in fact, this effect of pushing the price back down, if you think somebody's biasing, means that when there are potential manipulators in a market, that makes the market price more accurate than it would be without any manipulators whatsoever. That's a remarkable fact about these speculative markets. So, and here's a way to understand that. In the standard simplest model of speculative markets, there are two kinds of traders. One kind of trader is the proverbial informed trader, somebody who has some information that other people haven't traded on yet about which way the price should go. And the other kind of trader is who we call a noise trader, polite name for an idiot or a distracted person or somebody who just is trading but doesn't actually have more information than other people. And the standard model of financial markets has these two kinds of traders. And of course, on average, the noise traders are losing money relative to the informed traders. And the informed traders are trying to go trade against the noise traders. So if you were into a market and there were only informed traders, as an informed trader, that's not a very good opportunity. Yes, you have some information, but the other person you trade against would also have information. If they're trading in the opposite direction, that means your information cancels and you don't actually have a net reason to buy or sell this thing. So if you're an informed trader, what you want to do is you want to go find a market where there are a lot of noise traders and you want to trade against them. And because of that, informed traders are looking for where the noise traders are. And if they can find the noise traders, they will not only move there and trade, but they will trade more. They will raise the size of their trades, and then they will go actually make investments to get more information to trade in that market because they have a pigeon. They have, somebody to trade against on the other side. And this effect means that the more noise traders there are in the market, the more informed traders there are, and then overall, the more accurate the price. So adding noise to a financial market actually increases the accuracy because of this response. Add noise, other people say, ooh, I could profit by trading against that noise. Other people go collect information and then trade against the noise, and then they make money, and then the price becomes more accurate. So this whole process I've just described has a colorful anecdote, which is that if you ever sit down to a poker table, you should look around and ask, who's the fool at the table? If you don't see the fool around you at the table, it's you. Get up and walk away. So in general, you want to be the informed trader trading against an uninformed trader. That's how you should be at the poker table. if you go into a stock market and you don't think you actually know more on average than the other people trading in this market, you should not be trading. You should be walking away. You should only be trading if you think you have a good reason to believe you actually know substantially more than other people trading there. So the net effect here is that manipulation increases accuracy, at least when you allow enough other traders to participate so that they can correct the biases they perceive in manipulation. That was a long answer, but hopefully adequate.
Yeah. Well, I heard one of my friends who was betting on the outcome was making side bets. So hopefully that improves the quality of the question. This is just kind of a logistical question about the way that Futarchy would work. But suppose that you have two competing proposals. So for example, you have two subtly different versions of the infrastructure bill, such that each of them would be predicted to, in a vacuum, increase GDP plus. How would a betting market do both? Presumably not, because them together.
Okay, so let's stand back and realize what kind of a mechanism decision markets are. So a decision market is saying, was the overall outcome going to be improved or not by some particular measure? So it only really works for proposals that are big enough to influence the overall outcome of interest. So, as you may know, in, say, the United States, there are billions of decisions being made every day, and we couldn't subject each of those decisions to this sort of mechanism because almost all of them have very little influence over how national welfare is going to proceed. So this mechanism, as constructed, is only really useful for the biggest of decisions. And similarly, like the way our usual form of government works, say for Congress passing a bill, they don't pass billions of bills every year. They pass maybe hundreds of bills because, they have a limited time and attention, and so they can only pass a small number of bills, and therefore that mechanism is only appropriate for bills that would be important enough to be worth including in the few hundred, things you're going to consider in any one year. So this mechanism I've described fits that framework of expecting only a limited number of bills to be passed, and therefore, if you're only passing a limited number of bills because each one has to be really big, well, now they aren't coming through really fast. So for example, if you just passed if you had a vote on one bill every day, then if whatever bill is in front of you, you could consider that relative to the status quo. And then on the next day, you can consider, the next bill relative to the new status quo that changed today. So if you've got two related bills, whichever one gets considered first is going to be considered against the prior status quo. And then if that bill fails, then the next one will also be considered against that prior status quo. But if that first bill passes, now the next bill will be considered against that first bill. That is, does it add more to welfare than that first one? That's how we do all bills, basically, in a parliamentary system where we're voting on bills. The question for each bill is this an improvement over the status quo as of, before we consider this bill? Now, it's actually possible to have a system like Futarchy or decision markets with a lot more throughput. Instead of hundreds of bills, we could imagine thousands or millions of bills. And then we would use a mechanism I've worked on called combinatorial prediction markets, where you might actually ask the market about combinations. So if there were several related bills, you would explicitly basically be asking the market to weigh in on the combinations of passing both of them, passing neither, passing one and not the other, et cetera. And the market could, in fact, tell you which combination of bills in some area would be the most effective. Now, that would require a little more complexity in the mechanism, but it would be possible. But I think we get a huge improvement just with the simple version of Futarchy over the status quo. So I wouldn't recommend trying to go to the combinatorial version as the first thing you do. But it is actually possible to have a lot more throughput to get thousands or millions of bills being considered.
Yeah, so one concern that I have with Futarchy, I think overall I would certainly support Futarchy on a small scale for things like CEO markets. And if I had to bet on whether, at this moment, on whether or not Futarchy would work out well, if implemented in national scale, I think I would bet that it would work out well overall. But the one concern that I have is I think that if we're voting on values, people's selection of values has the potential to be considerably worse than people's voting upon policies, given that I think there's much more potential for harmful forms of signaling where people bet on values, people vote on values because it is, socially, it is socially popular to vote on values of the sort that they like. And I think that broadly, people are not very good at figuring out the things that they care about when thinking about implementing them at a national scale. And so it seems like it could run into problems with that, particularly because people's inconsistency about their values. So, for example, I think people most of the time think that, we should care about animals minimally, such that it should be very, very bad to kick a dog, but such that that should be a crime. But like factory farming, which tortures billions of animals every year, should not be a crime, just based on the nature of kind of just internal inconsistency between those two things. So I'm not, I guess the question would be, what about the concern that people would not select for very good values?
So the status quo also has people making choices that implicitly embody their values. So the question is, compared to the status quo, how would value choices be different here? And so the main difference here is that you're picking values more explicitly. So many people are familiar with situations where there's a device or automation that they use, and then they set some parameters on this automation, and then they see how it goes, and then they adjust the parameters on the automation to see if they get what they want. I mean, this is, of course, not a very common thing in factories. If you're making, breadsticks in a factory or something, then you've got a bunch of knobs that make breadsticks, and if the breadsticks are too thick, you turn the knob. If they're too brown, you turn the knob, etc. And you are, basically adjusting some parameters that explicitly represent your values, and you are sort of looking at the outcome and asking, do I like the outcome? That's a lot like making breadsticks by hand, where you make them some way, and if you didn't like this batch, you change how you do it with your hands. So in some sense, your hands are tools. So here we're talking about the difference between sort of directly approving a bill or supporting a bill and supporting a value measure that would imply bills. Now, if we're just talking about a repeated process whereby bills get passed and values get changed, then it can be the same sort of adjustment process that we do all the time, where, for example, when you're driving a car, you turn the wheel, and if you think you're veering off to the left of the road, then you turn a wheel to the right. And we're all familiar with lots of mechanisms like, devices for driving cars, where we adjust what we do to the outcomes we see. So under Futarchy, the idea would be that we would express our values, roughly in a way we thought made sense, and then we would see a sequence of decisions that resulted from that, and we would ask ourselves, did we like those decisions? So, for example, you could imagine setting up a Futarchy where we have a national welfare measure that was just focused on stuff that happens in the US, and then the market says invade Canada, and we go, oh. I didn't really want to invade Canada. And you look at the welfare measure and you say, well, the measure doesn't say anything about Canada. It doesn't care at all about anybody in Canada, what you do to them. And you may realize, oh, but I do care about people in Canada. So I guess I need to adjust my welfare measure. So that would no doubt be part of the process. That now, part of that might be, of course, that people would sort of not quite understand why the measure had been passed according to speculators. The speculators would have, thought that it was, so for example, what if the measure says, let a lot more trees get cut down? That's okay, they'll grow back or whatever. And it might be the speculators had a very complicated thought out calculation about how allowing trees to get cut down wouldn't really compromise the things you care about. But you see them passing a bill cutting down trees and you're going, wait, that can't be right. And you want to increase the weight on trees. And so presumably, if you had a strong enough opinion here, you'd crank up the weight on trees, and then you would see the market not approve cutting down trees so much. So, this would be the dynamic, is that you would look at the expression. Now, I think what you're alluding to is the idea that we might, we might not mind trees getting cut down, and we might not mind setting a system that made the trees get cut down, but we might mind explicitly having the market welfare measures say that we don't care about trees. So that would be sort of the additional thing of now somebody could point and say, well, the reason you're cutting down so many trees is this measure you approved doesn't care much about trees. Maybe it says 10 cents a tree or something, or $10 a tree, whatever. It's giving a low value on trees, and so that's why trees are getting cut down, because your market measure, your welfare measure says that you don't care much about trees. And then the question is whether that explicit, declaration about trees would bother you enough that you would then want to crank up the official measure about how much you cared about trees so that it looks like you do care about trees, even though you don't. And that, that's a way in which people want to look good in terms of the kind of values they say they have. So now it's not clear how bad that would be. That is, I can imagine the welfare measures being like complicated in ways that most people can't really quite figure out what it's doing. In which case they would be less embarrassed by having clear, welfare measures that made them look like they had values they didn't have, because it was harder to figure out what it was. So there is presumably a lot of scope for obfuscation and, muddying up the waters about what the welfare function is. And, that's an option that voters have. Voters, don't, and we do that today. So today, as you may know, we have a list of things on the books that are crimes. And that makes it look like we don't want those things to happen. But then we privately give the police instructions that say, don't bother to enforce those. And then they don't enforce those. And then we get it both ways, right? We get to pretend that we think prostitution's bad or that drugs are bad. And then we also get to not actually enforce laws against them very much because we privately give the instructions. So that's a combination of we put some things up and we say, hey, look at this really visible thing. This shows my values. And then there's the other indirect things that also express our values, but in ways that it's harder for people to point to or to verify. And then we get to be hypocritical. And so I expect Futarchy will also have ways to be hypocritical. I just don't think we've explored it that much. But to the extent that Futarchy is intrinsically less hypocritical, then it would have the problem of people like hypocrisy. Therefore, they don't want a system that makes it harder for them to be hypocritical.
Yeah, one mechanism that I thought of that I'd be curious to hear your take on for this would be similar to Futarchy, but slightly different. So rather than vote values, bet beliefs. It's so you bet on beliefs, but in terms of value selection. So I forget the name of the scheme, but you wrote an article about it that had people who are qualified all independently bet on what values they think the majority of people who are qualified and would come to. So so people have an incentive to figure out what the majority of smart people will want the values to be, and they have a financial incentive to do.
So, I mean, the key idea here is, the key philosophy here, just to be clear, is that I'm dividing governance into two parts, the values and the belief parts. And then I'm focusing on the belief part and making a recommendation for how to change that part. But I'm not focused on the other part and recommending a change there. So all proposals for change have to put some limit on the scope of their proposals. Nobody can, seriously consider a proposal for changing everything all at once. So you have to draw a circle around what you're changing, and outside that circle, you have to leave it alone, and you have to try to make things better inside the circle and accept whatever problems remain outside the circle. So here, the direct philosophy is we're changing how to decide what we believe in terms of the consequences of policy, but we're not changing the priority. So my proposal here was to try to keep the values part of it as close to what we're doing today. That's not to say that I can't imagine better alternatives on the value part as well, but it just feels like changing that at the same time is asking you to consider a lot of changes. But so, for example, if we're going to think about value things, there are many ways we could basically have some adaptive process that had some overall estimate of value, basically some functional form that represented values. and then have it fit to individual choices. We could, for example, like look at people who decide to leave the country or enter the country and how much they're willing to pay for things as a measure of value. So for example, we could just have the measure of value be, say, the auction price of people who want to buy their way into the country, right? We could just say the value of the country is, how much people are willing to pay to come in versus, be paid to leave. And that would be one way of defining the value, because it would be a marginal value. Basically, it would be saying, it's a lot like what we do with a company or real estate. Most other things we value in the market, in the economy, we value them in terms of what on the margin people would be willing to pay to get more or less of them. And we could do that with a nation as well. And there would be lots of other ways in which we could, like, fit some functional form to choices people make. And then we could even have people bet on what choices they think they would make if we can't get enough data what choices people do make. And there's just a whole space of ways you could try to elaborate that. And my main comment is just, I want to set that aside as a separate problem to be addressed separately, because I want you to consider one thing at a time.
Yeah. So in terms of the voting on values part, so one kind of related concern, which is sort of an extension of the concern I raised earlier, is I think that while the average person has mistaken beliefs about what policies should happen that are sometimes pretty bad, I think that people's beliefs about the types of things that matter are often significantly more in error than their beliefs about policy. So for example, recently I was having a conversation with a quite extreme deontologist who bit the bullet on, you oughtn't steal a penny to prevent infinite people from being infinitely tortured for infinite years. So I
mean, again, it's about, if what people do is they look at the stream of actual decisions that are coming out of this mechanism, and then they adjust the value parameters in order to get the decisions they want, then it's, less about, their values and more about how they interpret the decisions, and which is what they're doing today. So, today, the main thing that comes out of the system is decisions. And people are already, distorted in terms of which decisions they think are important, or which measures of decision outcomes matter, and matter how. Those are all mistakes people make. And they could make the same mistakes here, but at least here, some of the aspects of estimation would be taken out of ordinary voters' heads. And that would be the ways in which, this would be improving things.
Yeah, so my concern with that is, I think that in much of policymaking, we kind of take consequentialism for granted, which I'm quite happy about because I'm a consequentialist. But I think that if you ask people to figure out their actual values, I think people have all these idiosyncratic values that they would begin to care about if they thought about the values on a macro level. So for example, they would think you can't kill one person to save 5. And so, but if you program that into governance, well, that would complicate a huge number of things.
But governments make decisions. And as you may know, standard expected utility, the theory says that if you have a sequence of decisions and they are consistent in certain ways, then there are implicitly behind that a set of values. So, a sequence of government decisions and a set of counterfactual government decisions that might be made imply a set of values and a set of beliefs about the world. So you can't tell government not to make decisions based on values. The question is just, what is the process that produces the values that are implied in the decisions? That's the only option we have.
Yeah, that makes some degree of sense. Well, it makes a lot of sense. I mean, I still have some concerns that the value betting would be bad,
but again, that's the part I was just trying to keep constant with respect to what we have now. I think there's a whole space of other ways that we could try to, estimate values. But again, that's a harder thing. So in a lot of the smaller scale organization applications, like say Fire the CEO, I think we do roughly have a consensus enough on the values in order to be able to apply this. So the issues you're talking about are really only problems when we get up to these large aggregate scales anyway. So why not work on this and apply it in smaller scales first?
Yeah. And as you say, the failures of government are just so extreme, such that people are just so uninformed about so many things. And
But if you think about lots of small organizations and key decisions they make, it is quite common to be able to come up with outcome metrics about what you're trying to do with those decisions that people agree on. In terms of hiring a new person in a part of the company, all sorts of decisions, we can come up with actually decent metrics. Who to admit as a student to a school, which school you should accept as a student when you're trying to pick a school. There's just a wide range of decisions where it's not that hard to come up with decent proxies for outcomes.
Yeah. This next question is somewhat outside of your main area of focus, but as a matter of ethics, are you a consequentialist?
I am. I'm actually, as a matter of meta-ethics, a dealist. So that's a position I've carved out, which is to say that as economists, we make a lot of policy recommendations, and I see myself as an economist in the mode of the usual economist making policy recommendations, and people usually frame our recommendations as moral claims. And with respect to that framing, people think that economists are deficient in their moral analysis because we only seem to take into account a small range of reductive considerations about the outcome of the choices we're making. And they say, well, you should learn a lot more moral philosophy, you economists, and then you would be not so arrogant to make all of these big recommendations about how everybody should change everything based on your reductive, limited moral analysis. And so in the context of that sort of critique of what we economists do, my response is to say, these policy recommendations do not have to be framed as moral claims. And it's more productive and useful, I think, to pick a different framing of what we are doing, a non-moral framing of what we are doing when we're making these recommendations. So the idea is that in the world, we often face negotiations where we are trying to agree together with other people about arrangements of things, including what jobs we take and what marriages we're in and what the rules of our church is, etc. And in those negotiations, we each have something we want, and the choices we make will be influenced by us each trying to get more of what we want. And the standard economic analysis is exactly well suited to help us find the Pareto frontier, the maximal frontier of how we can all get more of what we want without anyone else getting less of what they want. So now this is framed in terms of this idea that what we want is expressed in our choices. And there's this revealed preference concept that if you make a sequence of choices, then implicit in that is some, values, i.e. what you want. And this thing you want may include some moral elements or may not, but the key point is it's not equal to morality and it may contradict morality. But still, each of the people involved has something they want in this negotiation. And we economists can be useful to people who are in the context of negotiations by helping them find this Pareto frontier of what they want. And our tools are well suited and designed for this purpose. And it's a useful function to play in the world. But it's not via telling you what the moral decision would be in this context, because that doesn't get you what you want necessarily. And you would rather have an advisor who tells you how to get more of what you want, even if it's not the moral thing, because that's what you want. And that's a sense in which that I call this dealism, or sort of this framing a stance toward what we do as recommending policy choices. And it's just rejecting the moral framing. And therefore rejecting the need to decide if it's deontological or consequentialist or utilitarian, other things. I don't have to pick any of those. I don't have to pick those categories, because in most of my conversations of policies, I'm not going to be, don't want to frame it as a moral question of what the moral answer is. I want to frame it as, how could we all make deals together such that we could all get more of what we want? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes a good degree of sense. I'm persuaded by some of the arguments coming out of economics for consequentialism. So like Harsanyi's argument for a form of utilitarianism based on Vienna. Well, I assume you're familiar with Harsanyi's argument.
Right, but I think it's basically built on this idea that what we're doing is suggesting deals. that, and if you aren't accepting the frame of we're trying to figure out what deals to suggest, there is no particular reason to accept Harsanyi's utilitarianism either, because it's about sort of, what's the Pareto frontier of what people want.
Yeah, so someone in the chat asks a question, which is, does Professor Hanson see selecting, well, you can read the question.
See selecting values for decision markets as analogous to ASI assignment challenges. What's ASI?
I'm not sure. Maybe artificial standard intelligence? Wait, the part 2 of the question is, if so, does he share Miri's concern that status quo democratic voting ASI utility functions would be catastrophic?
So maybe ASI is some, advanced artificial intelligence here, perhaps. So the
the person clarifies and he says super
intelligence. Okay. So the, in fact, how close is the analog is exactly a key question of dispute. That is, some people frame the superintelligence problem as the idea that you will only get one chance way early on to set the values of the superintelligence. Then after you make that early ignorant choice, then it will evolve across enormous orders of magnitude and in environments you can't anticipate. And then potentially those values would change through that whole process. And then later on, it would have a new set of expressed values that were the descendants of the original values you gave it. And then at that point, things happen and you might or might not like them. And in decision markets, in terms of Futarchy here, I've been painting a scenario where you have a current set of values and then they produce current decisions, but after you see the results of a decision, you can then change the values. And in fact, I actually have a variation on my Futarchy design where I have a way that you can veto current decisions on the basis of what estimates of future welfare will be. So basically, instead of having the markets decide to invade Canada, and then a few days later having us cancel the invasion of Canada, someone can actually just cancel the proposal to invade Canada on the basis of saying, you know what, in the next year we will change the welfare function so that invading Canada is not a good idea. And so again, but the key idea would be that, what I'm talking about here is an iterative process by which you have a current set of values that influences a current set of decisions, but you could look at the outcomes and use that to maybe judge whether you should change the values. And the purported scenario of superintelligence is exactly denying that you will get that chance to revise. And honestly, that's one of my main points of disagreement with that sort of frame, that sort of framing. I think that as artificial intelligences are improving and fielded, there will be lots of opportunities to observe what they do and revise their programming in order to respond to problems that are observed. That's how pretty much all design systems go and have since humans ever built any sort of tools. There are sometimes systems and tools where it pays to think ahead of time about all the things that could go wrong, because if some kinds of things go wrong, that means it'll be very hard to undo that. But I just don't think I buy that that's the typical case for artificial intelligence in the future. I think there may be some particular subsets of decisions like that, like maybe pushing the nuclear button or something. But for most artificial intelligence applications, they will be doing relatively small things over and over again in lots of different related contexts. So I think there'll be lots of opportunities to get data on the consequences of the values they're expressing and change them. I less buy the scenario that there would be. So part of the story by which people say there won't be time to react is this idea of sort of FOOM, that basically some machine in a basement that at the beginning of a weekend was almost nothing and had no implications for anything and didn't matter and nobody used it for anything. And then at the end of the weekend, it takes over the world. And therefore, the values it had at the beginning of the weekend are the thing that determine the values at the end of the weekend when it took over the world. And therefore, you need to make sure that everything in a basement that could possibly explode over the weekend to take over the world needs to have good values, and you can't be reacting to sort of how that thing is, acting in the world before then. But I just don't find that a very believable scenario.
Yeah, so going back for a moment to the point about dealism. So one concern that I would have about dealism, which is a point raised by David Enoch, is that it seems like what we want to be doing when we're trying to come to decisions is different from what we would want to be doing in terms of conflict resolution. So if we were deciding what movie to watch, it would be considerate to perhaps flip a coin. But if we were deciding whether or not to torture a cat, it seems like the thing that we should do would be to, regardless of what our friend wants to do, we should not flip a coin about torturing a cat under any circumstances, and instead we should not torture a cat.
Well, the coin flipping seems to be a distraction. The key question is, are we together setting policies about torturing cats? And of course, we in fact do, right? We, as you mentioned previously, we set policies that induce factory farming, right? We set policies that induce whatever happens to stray cats. We make policy choices, and they have consequences for basically cats being tortured and animals like cats. That's the fact of the world, right? So when we come together to try to make these policy choices, many of us, are horrified by the idea that our choices might end up torturing cats, and therefore part of what we want when we are trying to influence those decisions is to express these moral preferences we have about not torturing cats. So dealism isn't non-moral. It's sort of more meta. It says you want something, and part of what you want is morality, and your choices will therefore reflect morality to the extent that you want that and have a concept of that. And we're trying to set up a system by which, we could come to these decisions together and all get more of what we want. And in fact, if you don't actually care enough about not torturing cats, if we come together and make a negotiation for what policies to choose, you won't actually avoid it very much because you don't actually care very much about it. And a policy analyst who told you that torturing cats was immoral wouldn't actually have much influence over you, because you would realize that, they aren't a good advisor to you. They aren't telling you how to get what you want. They're telling you how to get what somebody else wants, right? So the idea here is that you're in a situation negotiating over some policy. You have some things you want. As an economist, we're going to try to help you get what you want. To the extent what you want is to be more moral, we will help you to get that. To the extent what you want is something else, we will help you to get that. It's up to you to decide how much you want to be moral. It's up to us to how to tell you how to coordinate together with other people to get the things you want.
All right, that makes some sense. Another interesting view that you hold is you're in favor of legalizing blackmail. So for those for those who are curious, explain your case for legalizing blackmail.
So the key idea here would be that humans have social norms. Norms are one of the earliest human technologies for social coordination. Norms are things you're supposed to do or not supposed to do. And we have this meta norm that if you see someone breaking a norm, then you're supposed to talk to other people and coordinate about how to shame that person and try to push them into stopping not breaking the norm. And we had norms against punching people, and norms against rape, and norms against killing, and norms against bragging and pushing people around. And we had norms for sharing food. Just in general, humans have norms, and it's one of our main mechanisms. And it was sort of our main mechanism for dealing with problems before we had law. So law is a more recent innovation in, say, the last 10,000 years. But before law, we had norms. And one of the things that happens with norms is we gossip. That is, if I see you doing something that's breaking a norm, I may well tell other people I saw that, and we may talk together about how we should not associate with you anymore, or try to, lecture you, or whatever we're going to do to try to get you to follow the norm. Now, blackmail is a situation where somebody does something, and it's something they don't want people to know. And somebody else comes along and says, I'm going to tell other people unless you pay me. And that's basically typically in the context of a norm. The only reason you would pay someone to keep quiet about something is if it's going to look bad if it gets out. And the reason it's going to look bad if it gets out is because it's the sort of thing other people will disapprove of if they hear about it. It's basically violating a norm. And in fact, most people are blackmailed for things like that, committing crimes, having affairs, etc. That's the nature of most blackmail, is people violating norms. Now, the interesting thing about blackmail is it's a law that, it doesn't ban you from talking about the thing. So if I see that you're having an affair, and I could just go tell people according to the law, that would be allowed. I could not tell people according to the law, that would be allowed. If you offered to pay me to shut up, I could accept that money. The only thing that's illegal is me offering to keep quiet if you pay me. So me initiating the offer is the only thing that's illegal under blackmail. I can accept your offer, and I could tell and I could not tell. So if we thought this norm that was being enforced was a bad norm, we could just tell people you're not allowed to say that thing. And we do that for some sort of things. There are some kind of things, even if you find out about it from somebody else, you're just not allowed to say. Like if I have a nude picture of you, I'm not necessarily allowed to share my nude picture with you about everybody else. So the blackmail is a situation where there's presumably a norm violated, and you don't want people to hear about your norm violation. And I could tell other people as a way of enforcing the norm. But often that's just a relatively weak way to enforce the norm, because, what do I get out of that? You might, retaliate against me. I've got other things to do. But blackmail is actually a stronger way of enforcing the norm. If I blackmail you and you pay me, the word doesn't get out, but you're punished in a sense as if the word had gotten out, because how much you're willing to pay me basically depends on how bad you'd be hurt if the word did get out. So blackmail is discouraging the norm violation, similar to how telling other people would discourage the norm violation, but it gives me a much stronger incentive to enforce this norm. So blackmailers are going to get money out of this. So people are going to be, when blackmail is allowed, they're going to be looking around for blackmail opportunities, and because that's a profit opportunity, they will be jumping on them. And say, if we think about even crime enforcement, like if I blackmail you because you committed a crime, I'm basically a substitute for police in detecting your crime. And there's more of me around than there are police, because there's a lot more people around you who might blackmail you than there are police who might catch you. And I would more naturally get the information than police would. It'd be a lot more expensive for police to get. And so it's basically a way of privately enforcing this crime law by having people around you blackmail you to keep quiet about your crime. So, in that more direct sense, blackmail is a substitute for official enforcement of crime. It's a cheaper, more flexible method of enforcement. It also, like in the actual criminal law system, people often get away with saying, "Oh, yeah, you want me to pay this fine, but I don't have any money. Sorry, I don't have any money." But with blackmail, people actually will be more willing to go scrounge around and find hidden money to pay off a blackmailer than they might admit to having. If the government says you owe a fine, they might pretend they don't even have that money.
Yeah, so I would have sort of two concerns. I'm currently forgetting the second one, but the first one would be that I think it's not clear that the norms enforcement provided by blackmail would be a good thing, because it seems like with a huge number of the things that we have taboos against, we want it to either there's some social good about it being publicly known, or we want people to not have an incentive to scrounge around and figure out people's hidden information, so that they can blackmail with them.
Do you have an example in mind? It might help if we just pick something concrete here.
Yeah. So so an example of the first case would be if there was a credible allegation that someone sexually assaulted someone else, such that they were not convicted, but the allegation is very credible. Seems like it is good for society if people know about that.
Well, I mean, the reason it's good to have people know about it is so that it can be punished. That is, the fundamental thing we want to do is not have it happen. And The reason why, if it happens, we'd want people to know is that's a channel by which they might be punished. They might be shamed. They might be fired from their job. They might be prosecuted by the courts. The reason, it's not just that we all want to know salacious gossip. It's not the purpose here isn't to just have people have more things they can gossip about. The purpose is to discourage the activity. That's the fundamental purpose of wanting the information. So if you can discourage the activity without the information getting out and more effectively, then that's a win.
Well, but there also is a social benefit to the information being known in that case, because, for example, people will be more wary about being alone around them if they've been consuming alcohol, for example.
Right, but that's sort of a small benefit compared to the more fundamental benefit of making it not happen. Right, more fundamentally, we're less eager to make sure people know when people do bad things than we just are to make sure they don't do bad things. That's the more fundamental purpose here. So we want, yes, if we can't prevent things from happening, we might want to at least warn people about them. But if we can find a way to prevent it, then that's the thing we want. And in this case, blackmail is a way of actually preventing it.
Sure, but I don't know that blackmail would be a particularly, like, in terms of the benefits after the fact. I mean, my intuition is that, I mean, it does not seem at all obvious that the number of sexual assaults prevented on the front end by the possibility of blackmail is greater than the number that would be prevented on the back end as a result of the information getting out.
But I mean, the information doesn't actually get out, right? This is the key point. Remember my scenario earlier. If I find something else you've done, I don't usually necessarily tell everybody. That's not what actually happens. It's rare if somebody finds out and tells somebody, because the people who find out know that they don't necessarily want to. So there's a good movie that came out, I guess, a year and a half ago called The Assistant, exactly about this scenario. It was, a movie producer assistant who found out about bad behavior about their new employer and, learned that they should be quiet about it and not tell anybody. They tried to tell people and other people told them to stop telling, and, that was going to get them in trouble. So if we rely on people telling when they hear about bad things, that's a pretty weak system. Most people don't tell. And even if you do tell, people don't necessarily believe you. But the blackmail is a much more reliable, much more strong incentive system. In that case of that movie, this woman might well have blackmailed this producer and gotten a bunch of money out of that. And in anticipation of that, this producer might have been a lot more careful about what they did.
Sure. So, I mean, I think that the question of whether or not the question of whether or not it, just as an empirical matter, what percentage of information gets out. I mean, I don't know how we would possibly know what percentage of information that people have, what percentage of the dirt that people have on other people.
I think we do, in fact, know. That is, if you look into, typical cases, you will find typically that a lot of people knew. I think this is a common finding in a great many of these cases once they're uncovered. People did not just one thing, they did it over and over again. And a lot of people around them knew. This is just the typical case. And those people who knew in some sense might be prosecuted, but almost never are. And so we in fact know, and you probably will too if you look in your own world, and maybe you're too young now, and maybe eventually, if you were 60 years old and I was asking you this question, you would just know. I would know that you would know, because you had been in the world long enough to see this sort of thing happen, and you would just know. You don't know now, but I'm telling you, the rest of us know. A lot of people know when things are happening, and they have incentives to pretend they don't know, because it's a lot of trouble.
All right. So the second horn of the dilemma is that there's a lot of information that we just generally don't want people to get out, that we don't want people to be outed for. And so, for example, you might have a fundamentalist Christian family who will disown their child if they find out that they're gay. And
so the obvious solution there is just to not let people tell. I mean, like I said, the interesting thing about blackmail is the person's allowed to tell, but they're not allowed to ask for money not to tell, and they'd be allowed to tell or not to tell. But if the problem is just the telling, then don't don't let them tell. So we can just restrict what kinds of things people can tell about each other. In fact, we do have some privacy rules about what kinds of things you can tell about other people. You can't, for example, as I said, just share nude, you can't take nude pictures of people and share them arbitrarily. You can't get somebody's social security number and post it, or their credit card numbers. There are just things you're not allowed to share about people, even if you manage to get that information. And if there are some things we don't want people to find out about other people, just say that you're not allowed to say that. That sounds much simpler than why make the anti-blackmail law, but still let them tell.
Yeah, that makes sense. So another concern is with blackmail law, you have a monopolist and a monopsonist, because there's one person with the info and one person who they're blackmailing. One idea that I had of a way of getting around this is you require them to share the info with 4 other people, who just like 4 other anonymous sources, and then they sell the information at the lowest price. So they like enter into a
I don't think it's so first of all, if we're just going to talk about practical blackmail here, people, if somebody's blackmailing you, you do not pay them a big sum of money all at once. That's the wrong way. What you want to do is pay them a stream of payments across time. If you make them a big payment right up front, then they could come back a month later and ask for another big payment, even though they promised they wouldn't, and you would still be, stuck wanting to pay them. So what you want to do is pay them a stream of payments across time. And one thing that protects you against is if other people find out and come to blackmail you, and now you can point them to each other and say, look, I this is how much I'm willing to pay to keep this quiet. You guys have to share this because, now apparently several of you know. And that would be limiting how much you have to pay. So already in typical cases where somebody might blackmail you, there are typically more people who might well find out. And that's an issue. The fact that one person's blackmailing you is a clue that other people might be coming soon.
Yeah, okay. I mean, my confidence in the desirability of legalizing blackmail is going up. But one concern that Ethan in the chat raises is, so Ethan says, it doesn't seem like people want to live in a society with a high premium for investigation of norms violations, especially investigations by close associates. A lot of the noise that we make about social taboos is signaling that we don't genuinely want to be vigorously weeded out. Also, when you can use courts to enforce blackmail contracts, then there is a big increase in premium for falsifying allegations against low-profile individuals.
I think it's worth pausing and noticing that previous ancient societies had a simpler solution. They said you weren't allowed to say bad things about people higher than you, even if it was true. So most blackmail is going to be of elites. As a practical matter, ordinary people are just not typically going to be the target of blackmail. Most blackmail is going to be of people who are relatively prominent, for whom public opinion matters more, and who have a lot more money. So blackmail law is mostly protecting those people. You aren't actually very vulnerable to blackmail if you are a relatively ordinary person who doesn't have much money, and of course doesn't care that much about other people think about you. So I think it's just remarkable. I think somehow people have framed this as if ordinary people were vulnerable, but I don't think that's just what's typically what happened.
I mean, I don't know. I can see situations where if you find out that one of your coworkers is having an affair, where you would perhaps blackmail your coworker. I mean, that scenario doesn't seem too implausible.
Well, it depends on what other relationships you have with this coworker. I mean, look, if you blackmail someone, they're not going to be happy with you. And they're probably going to look for other ways to retaliate, i.e. maybe look for some of your secrets. And you need to think about how safe you are with this sort of retaliation. Blackmail works best when the janitor finds something else out about the CEO or something, where you can take the blackmail money and then just go and leave the sphere of influence of this person you blackmailed. That's the more typical blackmail scenario. it's going to be just much harder to blackmail people who are you're closely connected with, because in some sense we all have ways we could threaten people around us that we usually don't. But usually, you know, that if you make a threat with somebody else around you, they can make a threat against you. Like if you think about the prophet thing, you could just accuse them of having an affair even if they're not having an affair, right? And you could demand that they give you money because you threatened to claim that you have an affair, right? And they know that will cause them trouble, but they also you also know that they're going to cause you trouble, right? You go and claim they have an affair, maybe they'll find out what your vulnerability is and go claim that about you. You've made an enemy, and in general, it's just not a good idea to be making enemies of people in your close social world.
Yeah, so yeah, I mean that makes some degree of sense. It seems like in most of these, like, there are concerns on both sides, and it sort of relies on people's intuitive judgments about whether or not the risks of blackmail would outweigh the rewards of cheap enforcement of social laws.
It's related to an important point, which is that sort of formal legal systems and things like blackmail are mainly only things that you want to invoke when there's a big problem, because just invoking it like creates tension and distance between people around you, right? That is, you're not going to sue your mother unless it's a really big deal. Just if you're unhappy with what they served at Thanksgiving dinner, it's not like a good reason to go sue, right? Just in general, when we have lots of relationships with people around us, we mostly use relatively informal social connection mechanisms to, show them our disapproval or to recommendations, and we might like gossip about them and send messages. But invoking sort of this more formal legal system is awkward and sends bad signals around, and not something you want to do unless it's a big deal. And similarly with blackmail, you probably don't want to blackmail people around you unless it's a pretty big deal, the thing they've done, and you're going to have some way like to run it. So if they say there's murder, you found somebody, they murdered someone, well, okay, that's a pretty big deal, and they could probably be willing to pay you a big amount, and you probably might be willing to quit your job next to them and go find some other job in order to take this blackmail payment and also just get away from them because, hey, they murdered someone. Maybe you just don't want to be around.
Yeah. So this is jumping around a bit here back to the Futarchy point, but so one proposal that was raised by, I think, Alex Tabarrok, writing for Marginal Revolution, was using Futarchy to resolve existential threats and to safeguard the future of humanity, arguing against a proposal by Thomas Wells, I think, arguing for like a section of the House of Lords it speaks for the future in Lorax-esque fashion. So I would be curious as to how a Futarchy would work in terms of preventing existential threats if we don't because it seems like with policies they would generally have a time horizon of maybe 10 years, or else they would be impractical because we can't predict with any degree of confidence the GDP plus thousands of years from now. And so given that, it seems like there would be perhaps an incentive to ignore existential threats. So what would be how would a Futarchy work in terms of preventing the end of the world?
So a measure of national welfare would naturally be composed of a measure of national welfare, say, per month, and then a weighted average of those across future months. And of course, you might even do it per month per subpopulation, like by gender and ethnicity and age or things like that. So, if we're doing sort of some total welfare, we're going to do a weighted average not only across subgroups, but across time. And how far into the future we put heavy weights on welfare is literally the thing that says how far into the future we care about. Now, these future welfare measures can be welfares of people who don't even yet exist. That's completely feasible as something we can produce. What we just need to be able to predict is that in the future, when those people do exist, then some process will be produced to aggregate their welfare and produce a number. And then that number will be used to pay off this asset, which is the national welfare asset for that month. So if you want to have decisions that put a high weight on the future, you literally just need to put high weights on those future welfare numbers. Now, in ordinary financial investment analyses, one discounts future financial returns because of interest rates, means that you can get more money in the future if you save money now. And so for ordinary financial institutions and say investing in companies, they have a standard way at which they weight the future according to standard interest rates. And many people have reasonably criticized saying, but the future matters more than that. That's discounting the future too much. And, a sort of market-based solution to that is to say, well, if you actually care more about the future than this market price reflects, then you should be buying up these assets that represent future returns in trade for assets that represent current returns, and your action will therefore be increasing the weight on the future. And if enough people buy up assets that represent future value, then we will value the future more. And in fact, over the last few decades, interest rates have been falling, which basically represents us putting a higher weight on the future. And arguably, you could say that's good. Many people think that's bad because it's going along with sort of more wealth inequality and more capital investment. But if you care about the future, then you like this. You say, great, we are now caring more about the future because interest rates are down and we are putting a higher weight on future outcomes. The national welfare measure doesn't have to copy the interest rate, though. It can just put a higher wealth measure on the future if it wants to. There's nothing preventing that. That's just a literal direct thing. So, for example, if somehow, 30 years from now, the country was completely destroyed in a huge nuclear war or something, then those assets would pay a lot less right after that war. And people who had bet on that would, be reflected in their payoff in those assets. So there, isn't a problem here other than will we choose to value the future? It's fundamentally about choosing the values. The mechanism itself is perfectly capable of letting you actually weight the future.
All right, that does seem to be a good mechanism of safeguarding the future, and certainly a better mechanism than having self-interested politicians who have an incentive to bluster about the future when they don't have a financial stake in making sure that things actually go best for future people. So one question that Ethan is asking is, what would Professor Hanson want to see in the next iteration of an in-trade-like service? I don't know what an in-trade-like service is.
In-trade was a betting market from a decade or two ago. So I am most interested in small-scale experiments within organizations. So large shared betting markets are less interesting to me because we aren't going to learn as much from them in terms of doing things. So, for example, I would like us to have markets on major national outcomes conditional on which party wins the presidency in each presidential election. We could have markets estimating GDP and lifespans and war deaths and, international respect. We could just have markets estimating those things as a consequence of which candidate wins the election. And then that would be available as information to voters. But I would prefer that to happen than to not have it happen. But what I'd most like to see is these smaller scale experiments, say like the firing the CEO markets, or even much smaller scale markets about hiring people. What I want to have happen is individual organizations to have these markets and see that they get value, and then have that become a standard practice in some particular organizations. And then those organizations to win basically compared to their competitors because they were using it, and then competitors to wonder why they are losing and copy it and have it spread through the society as a function of people seeing that they're getting value from it and then spreading and copying it. That's how pretty much all innovation needs to happen. That's the fundamental story. So it's not enough to have an idea for how the world should be better, or even a good argument for how the world should be better. And if I just go to some, huge application like the prediction markets about the consequences of becoming president, you could make an argument for why people should look at that, but they won't really be in the habit of looking at it, and there won't be that many social pressures that will get them in the habit. The fundamental problem about government is usually just not the first to innovate on things. Most social processes need to be innovated elsewhere, and then eventually, once upon a time, computers were a thing and businesses were doing computers, and then people looked at the government and said, how come the government's not using computers? And the government said, oh, I guess we should be using computers because that's what everybody else is doing. And the government isn't necessarily innovating all these things. They're being shamed into copying what other people are doing. And so what I want to do is go to the places where people most actually make new things happen and then create habits of those new things happening, and and stories about how it seems to be working and valuable. And I want those places to try it. And I want it to win there and have people say, yes, this is giving us value here, and then having it spread. And then eventually, larger organizations will think they should try it in other applications. But the firing the CEO one, I think, is close enough to application because you would see actually that the companies that were following this market advice just made more money on average. So I have a blog post from a while ago saying, if I had $1 million, I'd just want to create these fire the CEO markets on all the Fortune 500 and have those markets run for 5 years. And then at the end of that, we could collect all the companies that followed market advice in a quarter from the companies that didn't follow market advice. And if the companies that followed advice just got higher rates of return, then that would be sort of, evidence that the board of directors should follow it. And you could even maybe sue boards of directors into following that advice. And then, they would, so that would be like starting at the top of the prestige hierarchy. Once you legitimated this mechanism for firing CEOs, it would become more acceptable as something you could use at smaller scales as well. But what do I want Intrade to do or predict it to do? I'm just less interested because the people who would be watching those markets or trading them just aren't like in the habit of making decisions on the basis of these things that we could make a good habit there.
Yeah. So presumably, so you've encountered a wide array of objections to Futarchy. Are there any that you find persuasive to pose serious worries for the scheme? And if so, what are they? And if not, then what do you think is the least bad objection?
Well, I mean, we talked about the hypocrisy objection before, which is that this is not a system that lets people be hypocritical as easily, or at least we haven't learned how to use it to be hypocritical. I think that's close to the more fundamental objection is that when people think about politics, or they think about, first of all, when people think about politics, they are mostly interested in like finding an issue that's my side, their side, like, transgender bathroom use or something like that. It's not the most important issue in the world. It's just the issue that's most like lets them take one side compared to the other side. So most people are actually not very interested in overall system choices about governance, like whether it's bicameral legislature or unicameral, or whether it's a parliamentary system or once first past the post. Most people are just very quickly bored by that stuff. They don't really care about systems. They care about their side winning. And often the main way you can get them to care about systems is to talk about how it's making their side win or lose. So at the moment, there's a lot of interest in voting rules, like what kind of rules you're allowed to have about checking people at the voting booth, whether they're the person who claim they are, because people perceive that affects whether the Democrats or Republicans win the elections, or rules about mail-in ballots, et cetera. So people care about those rules at the moment because they think it affects, which side's winning. But if you just have a proposal for how everybody could be better off without it really affecting which side wins, everybody just gets really bored really fast. They don't care much at all. And if they're not thinking about which side wins, then they mainly care about just sort of abstract symbolic things. They think, well, wouldn't it be better if we had more initiatives, because then the citizens are having more influence? Or wouldn't it be better if we voted the candidates in more often, because that would be more democratic? Or they're looking for sort of just general symbolism related to the rules, not actually much in the details of what would work. So the fundamental problem with Futarchy in terms of governance is people just don't care fundamentally about whether it works or not. That's just not very emotionally engaging. So that's why I don't want to try to go that route. What I want to do is get like concrete small organizations to think they're profiting from it. and spread that around. And then eventually people will say, why aren't we using this for government? Because there are sometimes periodically when people realize that government isn't working as well and maybe they want it to work better. Like when they just lost a war, for example, or let's say they just badly handled a pandemic, right? There are cases like that where people suddenly think, well, gee, is the system like efficient? But that interest isn't very deep and it doesn't last very long. And so, it's just very hard to just play the game at all of arguing for a different form of government. That it's not a game that very many people care about. And the people who do care about it mainly care about it on some sort of symbolism. Say, a lot of people who want a different system, what do they mean? They want no more capitalism. Well, what does that even mean to them? It mostly means redistribution. They don't really know what it means, but basically it's just a way of saying, boo the status quo, boo the people who are in charge. And it's, they're not thinking about like the mechanics of how a different system might work.
Yeah. So one guardrail that I think should be done before a Futarchy is done on a small scale is you set up a betting market pre and post Futarchy on the performance of the company. Because I think that the betting market would predict that the company would do better under the Futarchy. But if it did not, then if we trust betting markets, then there's presumably some risk.
But just in general, any good system should be allowed to cancel itself, right? There should be a way you could ask any system whether it would be better to replace it with a different system. And a good system would at least allow that possibility. And certainly Futarchy would allow you you can ask it the question, should you not use this system or do something else?
Yeah, so you have some views about artificial intelligence and about the risks that it poses,
which we just discussed a little bit ago.
Yeah. So do you want to just lay out your basic thesis about what you predict will happen with AI in the next 70 years, for example?
Okay, so over the last century, we have had bursts of concern about AI and automation roughly every 30 years. And then before that, we had a burst of concern about a century before, around 1820. And we've had this long history of bursts of concern about AI and automation, wherein one of the things that happens that people say, look, we've seen some new stuff lately that's pretty impressive. Is this the moment when the machines are going to take all the jobs? Is that about to happen right now? And people asked that in 1820, and they asked it in 1930, and 1960, and 1990, and again here in 2020. And these bursts of concern are mostly bursts of sort of media attention and presidential commissions and movies, and sometimes bursts of investment or bursts of students taking different majors. But the actual trends have been much steadier than this 30-year cycle. We've seen relatively steady trends in automation over time, and the current levels of automation aren't remotely close to machines being able to take all the jobs. And the fact is, at the moment, AI is not about to suddenly take all the jobs. The automation we have now is just not remotely at the level that's going to happen in the next 30 years. It's also true that just over time, there's actually basically no correlation with jobs getting more automated and employment on those jobs or wages on those jobs. There's just really not much of a reason for localized concern about automation on particular jobs. However, there is this prospect that in the long run, eventually automation could do most of the jobs. And so it's a very legitimate concern to be thinking about that eventually date and preparing for it and wondering what to do about it and how it might appear, et cetera. My main recommendation is that we just get insurance so that, basically should robots take half the jobs or something in some time period, then suddenly you get a stream of money that gets paid out. That's insurance. And that would be the most robust way to deal with the potential problem that there might be some relatively fast transition by which suddenly lots of people lost lots of jobs to robots. But I don't think we're anywhere near that at the moment. But if we think that's a thing that might happen, then we should just arrange this insurance. And this insurance would be much more effective than some generic, universal basic income or something, because it's targeted specifically to the problem and not just giving money to lots of other people in lots of other situations. Now,
Yeah,
go ahead.
There was one kind of humorous pamphlet that I read that from a long time ago that predicted that the printing press would lead to the collapse of civilization and people being at home just sitting and reading manuscripts all the time, and just the jobs would all go away because we'd all just be like sitting and reading things all the time, which I thought was pretty amusing.
But I mean, now how exactly things will change when robots come here? There are actually like two main scenarios I think I would call your attention to. One is that the kind of automation we've been doing for 70 years will slowly improve and eventually get better. And the other is a scenario called brain emulation. So I have a book called The Age of M, Work, Love, and Life, When Robots Rule the Earth. And it's about what happens if this brain emulation scenario happens. But I think it's similarly plausible that the first human-level robots will be based on brain emulation, to the idea that they would be based on, familiar kinds of automation. But I don't need to make a bet about that in particular. But the brain emulation transition, if it happened, would be more sudden. That is, there's less point in having half a brain emulation or 10% of one. That's not very useful. You'd need a whole one, and so that would make a more sudden transition for the economy. And I have this whole book where I elaborate sort of how that would play out. And the Age of M, basically any scenario where robots are doing most of the work would probably have a much higher growth rate of the economy, maybe even doubling every few months, as opposed to doubling every 15 years like it does now. In the scenario where it's ordinary AI, I see less of a reason to expect a sudden transition. I would think it's going to be just more gradual, because I don't actually think there is a secret to AI. That is, a lot of the people who are imagining a very sudden transition kind of imagine that there's this one algorithm, this super algorithm behind intelligence that we haven't found yet, and it's running the brain and will run our intelligence in the future. And when we find this one algorithm, then oh boy, all of a sudden everything will change. And then they'll go gangbusters and just shoot ahead into the infinity of the future. I just don't think there is that one magic algorithm. I think there's just thousands of little algorithms that are in our heads and are in our software systems, and they will all slowly get better. But that means there isn't necessarily this threshold where all of a sudden, we find the key and boom, everything is doable.
So it seems like what the implication of what you're saying is, you would say that intelligence and well, I don't know if you would extend this to consciousness, or if this is just a point about intelligence and ability to make decisions, but it is not, there's nothing irreducible about it. It is reducible to a series of mental processes that kind of operate as like linearly, or perhaps exponentially or logarithmically. But
I don't think there's anything special or weird about consciousness. I think we understand the physics of the world around us, at least the kind of particles we're made of. I think we understand the basic mechanics of our brains in terms of how each brain cell works, in terms of moving chemicals around and things like that. There's a lot about the complexity of the software we don't understand in terms of how it's organized and why that works well. But I think the pieces we understand, and in the simple worldview of physics that shows the materials we're made of, and the chemistry of which our brains. Consciousness, the simple idea of consciousness is just that our brains have a software function that we can remember things, and we can, assess a wide range of integrated signals that we're getting, and we can present a coherent view of our agendas and our plans and our activities. And that's a feature of human brains, and it's a useful feature, and we have it. And there isn't much interesting to say about consciousness in addition to that.
Well, it seems like, there would be a distinction between a philosophical zombie and a human, and that one has, in one case, one just processes the signals, but one has a subjective experience such that it's like something to be a human, but it would not be like something to be a zombie. What would be your account of that, if there's nothing special or mysterious about consciousness in addition to the physical?
You're positing someone who, you're describing someone who posits that there is a special thing. So obviously, given the assumption that there's a special thing, you have to accept there's a special thing, right? this assumption they declare that there's a special thing is arranged very carefully so that it has no observable consequences whatsoever, ever, in principle. So it's a very special hypothesis that is being presented here. It says, look, yes, in addition to all this physics that we see going on, there's this extra consciousness thing, and it's an extra state, and it doesn't interact. It doesn't have any causal effects on the familiar physical states we see, and therefore nothing we will ever see or experience will ever be different as a result of this extra consciousness thing. And the obvious response is to say, well, why should we believe this extra consciousness thing exists? And and there's nothing we will ever learn that will tell us one way or the other, right? The hypothesis is designed directly to never be influenceable by any evidence ever. Therefore, why even talk about it? I mean, you can believe it exists, you can believe it not, but there's no argument we can give. There's no evidence. There's nothing we can ever learn because this hypothesis was designed exactly that way.
Yeah. So Ethan said something that I think is funny. He asked a prediction market. He said that both Hanson and Dennett are both philosophical zombies.
The question is, what outcome did you use to set the prediction market? So, the simplest forms of prediction market basically can tell you today what you might learn in some other way in the future. It's harder, though not impossible, to set up prediction markets that tell you about things that you will never directly learn in some other way in the future. If you tell me the prediction market says something, I have to say, well, how is it going to be judged in the future? What's this future resolution process by which the payoffs will be handed out?
Yeah. So I mean, I think that the reason why it's interesting to talk about consciousness is, well, I mean, we might accept the account that consciousness is causally inert. I'm not sure that I accept that account, but I have not. I'm kind of agnostic as to whether or not consciousness is causally inert. But it seems like we directly observe this thing. We have this subjective experience that is not accounted for by the hypothesis that there's not consciousness. But then it seems like there's almost this magic property that occurs, that brains have, that we have no idea how it originates. And so I think it's interesting to talk about.
I mean, I'd say there is not, we don't have evidence that there's such a magic process, I would say. That is, so for example, certainly if we think about how your brain is constructed, your brain has no evidence that you ever were conscious before this moment. The left side of your brain has no evidence whatsoever if the right side of your brain is conscious, right? If we're positing that all the same information signals would be sent around, except there's this additional consciousness thing, right? All the left side of your brain ever gets is signals from the right side. All you ever get from the past is signals in the sense of memories encoded, right? Nobody else, you'll never have evidence about anybody else. And we ask, well, the left side knows it's conscious, and I might break it down into 100 different parts. And I say, well, which part of the left side knows? Because each part of the left side only gets signals from the other 99 parts of the left side. And, we go farther down and we realize, where is this signal coming from that tells you that you're conscious? And you say, no, it's not a signal. It's just that I know. And I might say, well, you're not getting any evidence about this thing. There's no signal that's telling you you're conscious. You just have a habit of believing it. You claim that you know because you feel like you should believe it. That's basically what you're saying. I feel inclined to believe this thing, therefore I know it.
Well, no, I mean, I feel like I'm directly experiencing conscious. Like,
you're trying to say that you're built to say that, but I mean, if we look at the actual processes, we don't see that you're getting any evidence of it, right?
Wait, I mean, but are you not experiencing consciousness?
I'm not experiencing any extra consciousness above and beyond my brain activity, right? The whole point was we're defining consciousness as this extra thing above and beyond the ordinary physical interactions. I'd say I don't have any evidence that there's anything else other than my ordinary physical interactions, which, make me talk and feel, and I'll do all the things I do. But if it's there and it's real, it's part of my physical interactions. There isn't an extra thing.
But I mean, it seems like there's some subjective experience that you're like, there is some you who is hearing sounds right now, and
Right, but that's not non-physical, right? There's no evidence whatsoever that there's an extra non-physical thing.
Well, but I mean the like the ear vibrations in response to the noises are non-physical, but or sorry are physical, but the like voice inside your head, and the
No, those are physical. I mean,
well,
that's the claim here. I mean, that's the claim going up against the other claim. Again, remember, the whole point was somebody comes in and say, I posit this extra consciousness thing, like that you can have the same physical state, and in one scenario, it's just the physical state, and in the other scenario, there's the added consciousness. You're positing that that makes sense. And that's the part that I am denying. I'm saying I don't have any evidence whatsoever that there is this extra thing that could be in a different state other than my physical state. I'm obviously conscious and I'm physical, and I see no way I could even ever get evidence of this extra consciousness state that's beyond my physical state. I don't see any possible process by which I could get evidence of that. And I don't see a reason that I need to believe it. So why should I even consider it?
Well, I think that one thing that consciousness, one piece of data that consciousness explains is why we spend so much time talking about consciousness, because that would be very surprising.
But by assumption, that's not true. That is, by assumption, like if you had exactly the same physical state and we're not conscious, the claim is that that's a coherent thing to imagine. And in that scenario, you would be talking about consciousness because you would not have changed the physical state, and it's the physical state of your brain that's making you talk about consciousness, right? It's the thing that's producing these, sounds coming out of your mouth, etc. You have to imagine that's what the P-zombie sort of story is. You have to imagine that the brain has all the same passion and desire and a habit of talking about itself being conscious, even though it's not actually conscious. That's the counterfactual you are supposed to imagine.
But I mean, don't you have this inner observer called Robin Hanson that feels the world and?
But he's not a non-physical inner observer. I don't have any reason to believe there's a non-physical inner observer. I'm in my head.
Well,
I got a head here, and stuff seems to be coming out of my head, and it seems like basically whatever is the stuff I feel about, it's in my head.
Well, but I think that we can say that consciousness is reducible to physical states, but there certainly is still is consciousness that you're experiencing, even if it's
it's not extra, right? That's the whole point, right? So I see a video image of you on the screen. That doesn't mean there's anything of the screen that's beyond the pixels. I'm seeing the pixels on the screen, and I'm seeing you on the screen. You are the pattern of pixels on the screen. So I don't have to posit anything extra imagey about the screen here, or extra, person imagey about the screen. It's just the pixels in a pattern that show me you on the screen. Both of those are, there is nothing more than the pixels, and you are there on the screen. Similarly, there's nothing more than my brain and the processes in it, and there I am in my brain.
But so do you think that there's any substantive difference between us and P-zombies?
I just don't find the concept of P-zombie very plausible or coherent. But if you make me posit it, then I reject it, basically, right? I say, I don't think that you could have exactly the same physical state and have it either be conscious or not be conscious. That doesn't sound believable to me. And if it were true, I can see there would never be any evidence I could get about it. Right? But by assumption, by construction, if it were possible to have exactly the same physical states and yet have a difference in this extra consciousness thing, then nothing I observe in the physical states will ever tell me about this extra thing. Again, if we're assuming that it has no causal impact. If it does have a causal impact, then I've got big questions, because we understand the physics of the atoms in your brain pretty well, and the chemistry in your brain. And when we've looked at atoms and chemistry, we've not seen this extra thing that supposedly has a causal impact. And if you could define the theory of its causal impact in more detail, we could look to study that, but I'd be pretty skeptical you'd find anything.
Okay, so Ethan says in the chat, where is his mental image? We've chopped open brains and never discovered mental images. We've found neuronal configurations that his experience of we've found neuronal configurations that his experience of that mental image may supervene on.
Well, it's the same way as saying, if you looked at the pixels on my screen, I wouldn't see you. One pixel at a time, if I looked in a microscope at each of those pixels, which would be quite possible to do, in none of those pixels would I find you. Yet there you are on my screen. Obviously, you are a pattern of the pixels on my screen. If you have to look at the patterns in order to see you on my screen, and you'd have to look at the patterns of cells and their firings in my brain in order to see me in my brain. You wouldn't, looking at any one cell, you wouldn't find it.
Yeah, so Ethan is asking if he could come on and chat with you. Would you have any objection?
No, I don't have any objection. If you have
right.
a mechanical way to do that, but obviously Ethan has been typing a lot here and part of this, so we're happy to see his face. Although, this is a pretty different topic than the other topics we've been discussing. Now, well, while he's coming on, I guess I have to say, when we talked about brain emulations in the past, so many people got obsessed with this topic. I decided to write this book on the topic I thought everyone was neglecting. I thought everybody was neglecting what would actually happen if there were brain emulations. People were very focused on, is it conscious? Is it me? Those sorts of things. And I think there are many of these sort of topics where people just get obsessed with these philosophy questions so much so that they neglect, like, the more fundamental, I would say, practical questions of what would happen.
All right. Let's see if Ethan is. Ethan has a lot of thoughts about consciousness. We've discussed the subject before.
Right. Well,